When I first opened The Little Prince, I did not only read a story for children. I encountered myth, a parable folded into the language of the child and addressed to the adult soul. In the pages of Saint-Exupéry's tale, there is a condensed map of the psyche, images and episodes that, to my way of thinking, speak directly to processes I called individuation, the long and often perilous movement of the soul toward wholeness. At the heart of the tale stands a child, the little prince himself. The child figure is one of the oldest and most universal of archetypes. In dreams, amidst the child appears as promise, renewal, and the source of fresh vision. He comes with questions that shatter adult complacency, simple questions that force adults to see how their souls have been domesticated by utilitarian concerns. The little prince asks, what does it mean to tame? And in doing so forces us to reflect on intimacy, responsibility, and the way meaning is created between two subjects who recognize one another. In Jungian terms, that taming is the establishment of relation between ego and object that is not merely projection, but reciprocal recognition. The prince's relationship with the rose is instructive. The rose is both beloved and demanding, symbolic of an interior figure that is simultaneously delicate and sovereign. We might say she functions as an anima figure, not in the technical sense of my early formulations about masculine psyche, but as a soul image that awakens longing and responsibility. To love the rose is to accept the vulnerability of attachment. To care for her, despite her thorns and vanity, is to take up the labor of relating, which in the language of individuation means allowing the self to be known through relationship. The adult characters the prince visits, the king, the vain man, the businessman, the drunkard, the lamplighter, the geographer, are caricatures, but their caricature is instructive. They are personifications of malformed attitudes of consciousness. The inflated persona, the compulsive will to power, the addiction to external validation, the numbing avoidance of pain. Each station in the prince's journey reveals an attitude that blocks the soul. My reading here is plain. The ego, when it identifies too absolutely with roles and public masks, becomes divorced from the life of the unconscious. The heroic danger is not merely external failure, but inner bankruptcy, a life without symbolic depth. The desert in which the narration pivots is itself a powerful symbolic milieu. Deserts in mythic language are places of stripping. They remove external distractions and expose the inner condition. The aviator stranded in the Sahara, the narrator, becomes a mirror for the adult who has lost his inward compass. His mechanical and practical knowledge, skillful, competent, is insufficient to reckon with the existential emptiness that the little prince's questions reveal. The encounter between the adult, the ego, practical and exhausted, and the child, the spontaneous, uncalculated soul, is the very scene of transformation. The ego is challenged to open, to be willing to listen. Another compelling symbol is the fox. The fox teaches an essential lesson. One sees clearly only with a heart. From a Jungian perspective, this is not merely sentimental rhetoric. It is a pointing toward effective knowledge as a valid mode of cognition. The modern mind's exile from its feelings produces illusions of knowledge that are brittle and utilitarian. The act of taming, of entering into a ritual relationship, of establishing unique time and shared meaning, is a psychical technique for restoring the heart's capacity to know. The fox's counsel is an initiation into relational consciousness. Meaning is crafted in the space between two subjects. One must also attend to the motif of return. The prince's decision to go back to his planet, hinted at in his encounter with the serpent, contains the paradox of individuation. Growth often requires a descent that appears like loss. The serpent, a myth often ambivalent, death and transformation entwined, signals a necessary relinquishment, a passage that may be read as the soul's move beyond naive attachment toward a greater, integrated reality. The end of the tale is not merely tragic. It is sacramental. The loss is a threshold. Finally, the proliferation of symbol images, stars, wells, roses, snakes, is not mere childlike ornament. Symbols are living bridges to the unconscious. They function like active imaginations. If attended to, they show what the psyche prefers to make visible through mythic form. The Little Prince, with his travels and questions, is a corrective to those who live a life of utility without meaning. He reminds us that the adult task is not the conquest of the world, but the reconciliation of the inner drama. Thus, the story reads for me as an archetypal map. The child archetype is guide, the adult persona is obstacle, the taming ritual is technique, the desert is crucible, and the return as transformation. In later parts, one will examine how specific episodes, the king's authority, the drunkard's compulsion, the fox's taming, the rose's vulnerability, the serpent's passage, function as precise coordinates in the psyche's geography of becoming. For now, hold this. The Little Prince is an invitation. It calls us to listen to our inner child, to honor the images that come from the heart, and to take the painful, beautiful labor of learning how to love. When we move deeper into The Little Prince, the next stage of the journey reveals itself through encounters with archetypal figures, each representing a psychological distortion. Let us begin with the king and the vain man, two characters who, though clothed differently, are united in their dependence on appearances. To analyze them is to study the phenomenon I have called the persona, that mask which we all must wear to function within society, but which becomes dangerous when mistaken for the fullness of the self. The king, seated upon his throne, insists he rules over all things. He claims authority over the stars, demanding obedience to his imagined sovereignty. Yet when pressed, he adjusts his commands so that they're always obeyed, ordering only what would happen anyway. This is an empty authority, a caricature of real power. Psychologically, he represents an ego that has mistaken his persona, the role of ruler, commander, decision-maker, for genuine psychic mastery. In truth, this inflated ego commands nothing. It is terrified of its own limitations, hiding behind words and rituals of control. I have seen this attitude in many patients. They come with the certainty that their lives are under command, their schedules filled, their roles well-defined. Yet, when the currents of the unconscious break through, a dream, a crisis, a breakdown in health or relationships, their orders collapse into dust. The king is the archetype of false sovereignty, an ego divorced from the self. The vain man, by contrast, is ruled not by power but by the gaze of the other. He asks the prince to clap, to admire, to feed his endless hunger for validation. Without admiration, he feels invisible. With it, he feels alive. Here again, the persona is at play, the self that exists only as it is mirrored by society. His mask is fragile, his soul empty. He reminds us that when we live solely for recognition, applause, likes, approval, we become hollow, feeding endlessly on the projections of others. These encounters carry profound warnings for the adult psyche. Both the king and the vain man illustrate what happens when persona, the necessary mask of adaptation, becomes over-identified with the ego. The king believes he is authority. The vain man believes he is admiration. But in truth, both are cut off from the deeper self, from the wellspring of inner meaning that is not dependent upon outer masks. I would invite you, as you reflect on these figures, to ask yourself, in what ways have you mistaken your role for your identity? Do you live as though your worth were tied solely to your job title, your public image, or the approval of those around you? These questions are not merely intellectual. They are invitations to self-examination. The Little Prince, with his innocence, pierces these illusions. He is neither impressed nor deceived. His questions expose the hollowness of the king's commands and the vain man's vanity. In this way, the child archetype functions as a mirror, reminding us that the essence of who we are cannot be reduced to roles or applause. And here, I would ask you, as I often encourage those I counsel, to share your reflections. If you were to map your life today, which figure do you recognize in yourself? Do you see more of the king, clinging to a false sense of control, or the vain man, dependent on admiration, perhaps both? In the comments below, tell me, what country do you live in, and how do these archetypes manifest in the culture around you? It fascinates me how differently, yet universally, these masks appear in every society. As we proceed, we will encounter other figures: the drunkard, the businessman, the lamplighter, the geographer. Each reveals another distortion of consciousness, another mask that hides a living soul. But for now, let us dwell on this. Without self-reflection, the persona can become a prison. With reflection, however, the mask becomes transparent, allowing the light of the deeper self to shine through. As we follow the little prince on his journey, two more striking figures emerge: the drunkard and the businessman. Though they differ outwardly, both embody psychological traps that I have witnessed countless times in the human soul. They are mirrors of our collective struggles, one with the impulse to numb, the other with compulsion to accumulate. The drunkard is perhaps the most tragic of all. When the little prince encounters him, he finds a man drowning in shame. He drinks to forget that he drinks. Here is a cycle of addiction laid bare. The attempt to escape suffering through an act that deepens the very suffering one tries to flee. The drunkard's world is small, suffocating, and self-perpetuating. He has collapsed into what I would call the shadow, that part of the psyche where all we reject, fear, or repress resides. When the shadow is ignored, it does not disappear. Instead, it erupts in destructive forms: addictions, compulsions, obsessions. The drunkard embodies this reality. He is not evil. He is lost, consumed by the very darkness he cannot face. And this raises a question for us. What are the ways in which we drink, metaphorically or literally, to forget our pain? Do we drown ourselves in distractions, in endless scrolling, in work, in food, in substances? Each act may serve as a small cup of wine, meant to silence the inner cry. But silence is not healing. Now, contrast this with a businessman. Here we meet a figure consumed not by shame but by greed. He spends his days counting stars, declaring them his possessions. Yet his ownership is meaningless. He cannot touch the stars, use them, or share them. His wealth is illusory. He represents a psychic trap of inflation through possession. The belief that identity and worth are measured by what one accumulates. In the businessman, I see the psychological wound of our modern age. Many today live as though the stars of their lives, money, status, achievements, could be counted endlessly, securing them against mortality. Yet, this counting never ends. The hunger grows insatiable because it is not material accumulation that nourishes the soul, but connection to meaning. Without that, one is left with endless numbers and an emptiness behind them. Together, the drunkard and the businessman reflect two sides of the same coin. One escapes life by numbing it. The other escapes life by trying to control and hoard it. Both are forms of avoidance, ways to sidestep the deeper questions. Who am I truly? What gives my life meaning? The Little Prince, with his childlike directness, reveals the futility of both. He sees that the drunkard cannot escape his pain, and that the businessman cannot own the stars. His innocence exposes truths that adults, trapped in their masks, cannot see. I invite you, as you reflect, to pause for a moment and ask, where in your own life do you see echoes of the drunkard or the businessman? Do you sometimes turn to escape, perhaps through substances, entertainment, or habits, to silence your inner voice? Or do you sometimes chase accumulation, money, possessions, status, hoping it will fill the emptiness inside? If you feel comfortable, share in the comments not just your answer, but also where you are watching from. It would be illuminating to see how these patterns appear across different countries and cultures. The wisdom of the story is not meant to shame, but to awaken. Both the drunkard and the businessman remind us that healing lies not in escape or possession, but in confronting the inner depths we so often avoid. To turn toward the shadow, to integrate it, is to recover wholeness. In the next part, we will journey to the lamplighter and the geographer, figures who reveal the paradox of duty and knowledge without wisdom. Their new insights will unfold about the balance between routine, responsibility, and the search for meaning. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince is widely celebrated as a philosophical tale, ostensibly a children's book, yet layered with profound existential and psychological meaning. From a Jungian perspective, This narrative serves as a rich allegory for the human psyche, encompassing archetypes, individuation, and the interplay between conscious and unconscious dimensions. Carl Jung's analytical psychology offers an illuminating framework for understanding the symbolic and psychological depth of Saint-Exupéry's narrative, revealing a journey towards self-realization and integration. At the heart of The Little Prince is the archetype of the innocent or the child. In Jungian terms, the child archetype embodies a potential for growth, renewal, and transformation. The Little Prince himself represents the pure, untainted aspect of the psyche, the self in its nascent form, unbound by societal conditioning or the limitations of rational thought. His exploration of various planets, encounters with figures such as the king, the vain man, and the lamplighter can be interpreted as encounters with different aspects of the collective unconscious, each representing psychological complexes or developmental challenges. Through these encounters, the Little Prince experiences symbolic trials, mirroring the individuation process, in which the conscious ego confronts, integrates, and reconciles with unconscious elements. Jung's notion of archetypes, the universal, primordial symbols residing in the collective unconscious, provides a key to understanding the characters and motifs within the story. The fox, for instance, embodies the archetype of the wise guide or mentor. The fox's counsel, one sees clearly only with the heart, reflects the activation of intuitive wisdom and the reconciliation of the conscious ego with deeper, instinctual knowledge. In Jungian terms, this interaction represents the integration of anima, the inner feminine aspect of the psyche, allowing the Little Prince to access qualities of empathy, love, and relational awareness. The fox teaches a principle of individuation through relational experience. Only through forming meaningful bonds does one encounter the fullness of one's self and purpose. The rose, arguably the most symbolically rich character, embodies dual aspects of archetypal meaning. On one level, she represents the anima or the inner feminine, eliciting both devotion and longing. On another level, the rose embodies ego-complex dynamics, particularly in the form of attachment, idealization, and projection. The Little Prince's struggle to understand and care for the rose parallels Jung's concept of differentiation, the process by which one recognizes projections of the unconscious onto external objects, learns to distinguish subjective fantasy from objective reality, and ultimately achieves emotional maturity. The rose's complexity mirrors the multifaceted nature of the psyche, illustrating that love, attachment, and suffering are intertwined components of psychological development. The narrative structure itself mirrors the symbolic journey of individuation. The Little Prince's travels across planets reflect the descent into the unconscious and the subsequent ascent towards self-integration. Each planetary figure represents a shadow aspect or psychological archetype that must be confronted or understood. For instance, the king symbolizes the authoritarian aspect of consciousness, the need for control, and the ego's attachment to external validation. The vain man embodies the inflated ego and the compulsion for recognition, highlighting the dangers of narcissistic tendencies. The lamplighter reflects the repetitive, unconscious patterns of behavior that dominate ordinary existence, emphasizing the challenge of awareness and intentionality. Jungian analysis interprets these encounters as manifestations of the journey to reconcile conscious awareness with the shadow, those disowned or suppressed aspects of the personality. Moreover, the recurring motif of exploration and return illustrates the cyclical nature of individuation. The Little Prince leaves his asteroid in search of understanding, encounters a multiplicity of external worlds, and ultimately returns transformed. This mirrors Jung's description of the psychological journey. The ego ventures into the unconscious, confronts archetypal realities, experiences symbolic death and renewal, and integrates these insights to achieve a higher level of consciousness. Saint-Exupéry's poetic narrative style underscores the emotive and intuitive dimension of this journey, emphasizing that rational analysis alone cannot fully grasp the depth of human psychological experience. The story's simplicity belies the profound unconscious processes at work, aligning with Jung's insistence on the necessity of symbols and myths in accessing the psyche. Another key Jungian concept relevant to The Little Prince is the interplay between the persona and the authentic self. The adult characters, often absurd and narrowly focused, represent the dominance of persona. The social mask one wears to navigate societal expectations at the expense of authentic inner life. The Little Prince, in contrast, embodies the uncorrupted self, unbound by these social masks, and his perspective challenges the reader to reconsider the constraint imposed by adult rationality and conformity. Through his eyes, the familiar world becomes a mirror for inner psychological truths, suggesting that genuine insight and wholeness require transcending superficial appearances and reconnecting with the imaginative, intuitive core of the self. In conclusion, a Jungian reading of The Little Prince reveals a multi-layered psychological allegory that transcends its apparent simplicity. The narrative can be interpreted as a symbolic exploration of the individuation process, illustrating the integration of archetypal forces, the reconciliation of ego with the shadow, and a harmonization of the conscious and unconscious psyche. Through the lens of Jungian psychology, The Little Prince's journey becomes not merely a tale of whimsical adventure, but a profound guide to understanding the human soul, the necessity of relational bonds, and the transformative power of love and self-awareness.